The tires of Dr. Evelyn Marsh's Mercedes crunched over the gravel driveway as she approached the lake house, a looming silhouette against the fading light of dusk. Lake Tahoe stretched before her, a vast mirror reflecting the encroaching darkness. The November air bit at her skin as she stepped out of the car, the chill seeping into her bones like a premonition. Evelyn's breath formed small clouds in the air as she fumbled with the keys, her usually steady hands trembling slightly. The lock clicked, and the door swung open with an ominous creak. Stale air rushed out to greet her, carrying with it the faint scent of mold and forgotten memories. As she stepped inside, the floorboards groaned under her weight, as if protesting her intrusion. Evelyn's hand searched for the light switch, and when she found it, the sudden illumination revealed a space frozen in time. Dust-covered furniture loomed like sentinels in the shadows, and faded photographs stared accusingly from the walls. Evelyn's eyes were drawn to a particular image, a family portrait from years ago. Her younger self smiled back, flanked by her parents and sister. The glass of the frame was cracked, a jagged line running through her sister's face. Evelyn quickly turned away, her heart racing. "Get a grip," she muttered to herself, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. She was here for a reason, to confront her past, to heal. As a psychologist, she knew the importance of facing one's demons. But standing here, in this house that held so many memories, Evelyn felt more like a patient than a doctor. She made her way to the kitchen, each step echoing through the empty rooms. The faucet sputtered and coughed before releasing a stream of rust-colored water. Evelyn watched it run, mesmerized by the swirling patterns it made in the sink. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw faces in the rusty spirals, contorted, screaming faces. Shaking her head, Evelyn turned off the tap and reached for the bottle of whiskey she'd brought. The amber liquid sloshed invitingly as she poured a generous amount into a dusty glass. The first sip burned its way down her throat, a familiar comfort in this unsettling place. As night fell, the darkness outside seemed to press against the windows, seeking entry. Evelyn found herself constantly glancing over her shoulder, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The house creaked and settled around her, each sound making her jump. She tried to focus on her breathing, employing the techniques she often taught her patients. In for 4, hold for 7, out for 8. But with each exhale, she felt a heaviness in her chest, as if something was trying to claw its way out. The whiskey bottle emptied faster than she'd intended, and with it, her defenses began to crumble. Memories she'd long suppressed bubbled to the surface of her mind. The argument with her sister, the slamming door, the screeching tires, and then silence. Horrible, accusatory silence. Evelyn stumbled to the bathroom, her vision blurring. The face that greeted her in the mirror was a stranger's, hollow-eyed and haggard. As she stared, the features seemed to shift and distort. For a terrifying moment, she saw her sister's face superimposed over her own, eyes wide with fear and mouth open in a silent scream. A sob tore from Evelyn's throat as she stumbled backwards, knocking over a stack of towels. Something clattered to the floor, a small orange bottle. Her prescription. How long had it been since she'd taken her medication? With shaking hands, Evelyn retrieved the bottle, spilling several pills onto the cold tile floor. She swallowed 2 dry, choking slightly as they stuck in her throat. As she leaned against the wall, sliding down to sit on the floor, a sound cut through the silence. A scream. It came from outside, from the direction of the lake. High-pitched and inhuman, it sent shivers down Evelyn's spine. She scrambled to her feet, rushing to the window. The lake was a black void, its surface unbroken. Nothing moved in the moonlight. Had she imagined it? Was her mind playing tricks on her? Evelyn pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her breath fogging the pain. And then she saw it, a ripple in the water, expanding outwards. Something was out there. The scream came again, closer this time. It was a sound of pure anguish, of unimaginable pain. It resonated within Evelyn, stirring something deep and primal. Fear clawed at her insides as she realized the terrible truth. The scream was familiar. It was the same sound she'd heard the night of the accident, the night she'd lost her sister. Evelyn's legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor. The room spun around her as the effects of the alcohol and medication mingled with her rising panic. The walls seemed to close in, and shadows danced at the edges of her vision. As consciousness began to slip away, Evelyn's last coherent thought was a chilling realization she had made a terrible mistake coming here. The lake house wasn't a place of healing, it was a trap, and she had willingly walked right into it. The scream echoed once more, but this time, Evelyn wasn't sure if it came from the lake or from her own tortured psyche. As darkness claimed her, the lines between reality and nightmare blurred, leaving her adrift in a sea of terror that threatened to consume her entirely. If you are enjoying it, please help the channel by subscribing and leaving a like. Evelyn awoke to the sound of water dripping. Slow, steady, maddening. Drip, drip, drip. Her head throbbed, a dull ache pulsing behind her eyes as she struggled to focus. The bathroom floor was cold beneath her, and pale morning light filtered through the frosted window, casting eerie shadows across the tiles. As she pushed herself up, a wave of nausea hit her. The events of the previous night came rushing back, fragmented and distorted. The scream, the lake, her sister's face in the mirror. Evelyn's hand trembled as she reached for the sink, pulling herself to her feet. The face that greeted her in the mirror was haggard, dark circles underlining bloodshot eyes. But it was her own face this time, not the nightmarish vision from before. Evelyn let out a shaky breath, trying to convince herself it had all been a dream, a product of alcohol and guilt. But as she splashed water on her face, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A single strand of long, dark hair was wrapped around her finger hair that wasn't her own. Evelyn's hair was short and graying. This hair was like her sister's had been. She stumbled out of the bathroom, her heart racing. The house seemed different in the daylight, shadows retreating to corners but not disappearing entirely. They lurked waiting, watching. Evelyn made her way to the kitchen, desperate for coffee to clear her head. As the machine gurgled to life, she noticed a trail of wet footprints leading from the back door to the living room. Her breath caught in her throat. She lived alone. She had come alone. Following the prints with trepidation, Evelyn found they ended abruptly in the middle of the room. A puddle of water had formed, and in it, she saw a reflection that wasn't her own. For just a moment, a pale face with wide, accusing eyes stared back at her from the watery surface. Evelyn recoiled, blinking rapidly. When she looked again, it was gone. Just a puddle on the hardwood floor. But the hair on the back of her neck stood on end, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The coffee maker beeped, startling her. As she poured a cup with shaking hands, Evelyn tried to rationalize what was happening. She was a scientist, a doctor. There had to be a logical explanation. Lack of sleep, guilt, possibly a bad reaction to mixing her medication with alcohol. But deep down, in a place she didn't want to acknowledge, Evelyn knew something was terribly wrong. The lake house held secrets, and they were seeping out like water through cracks in a dam. As she sipped her coffee, Evelyn's gaze was drawn to the lake outside. The surface was calm, belying the horrors she thought she'd witnessed the night before. But something caught her eye, a dark shape beneath the water, close to the shore. It could have been a log or a shadow, but to Evelyn's increasingly paranoid mind, it looked disturbingly like a human form. The coffee cup slipped from her grasp, shattering on the floor. Evelyn barely noticed, her eyes fixed on the lake. The shape was moving slowly but surely towards the house. Heart pounding, Evelyn rushed to the door, throwing it open. The cold air hit her like a physical force, but she barely felt it. She ran towards the water's edge, her bare feet sinking into the cold with sand. But when she reached the shore, there was nothing there. The lake was empty, its surface unbroken save for small ripples caused by the breeze. Evelyn stood there, panting, her mind reeling. Had she imagined it all? A sound behind her made her spin around. At the tree line, just for a second, she thought she saw a figure. Pale, dripping wet, with long dark hair obscuring its face. Then it was gone like smoke in the wind. Evelyn's legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the sand. Tears streamed down her face as she hugged herself, rocking back and forth. "It's not real," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's not real." But the voice that answered came not from her own lips, but from the water behind her. "Oh, but it is, Evelyn. It's all real." She turned slowly, dreadingly. There, half submerged in the lake, was her sister. But not as she had been in life. This version was bloated, skin pale and mottled, hair tangled with lake weeds. And her eyes, God, her eyes were full of accusation and hunger. Evelyn scrambled backward, a scream building in her throat. But before it could escape, the apparition vanished, leaving only ripples in its wake. The scream that had been building erupted from Evelyn, echoing across the lake. It was the same scream she had heard the night before, she realized with dawning horror. It had been her own voice all along. Evelyn ran back to the house, slamming the door behind her and locking it, as if mere wood and metal could keep out the horrors she'd seen. She slid down to the floor, her whole body shaking uncontrollably. The logical part of her mind, the part that had made her a successful psychologist, tried desperately to make sense of what was happening. Hallucinations, she told herself. Stress-induced psychosis. But the terror coursing through her veins told a different story. As the day wore on, Evelyn found herself jumping at every sound, every shadow. She double-checked locks, drew curtains, and kept her back to walls. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that something had followed her into the house. Night fell, bringing with it a new level of dread. Evelyn huddled in her bedroom, lights blazing, a kitchen knife clutched in her trembling hand. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows, sent her heart racing. And then, cutting through the silence like a knife, came the scream. But this time, Evelyn realized with dawning horror, it wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't coming from the lake or from her own lips. It was coming from inside the walls. As the scream grew louder, seeming to emanate from everywhere at once, Evelyn covered her ears and shut her eyes tight. But she couldn't block out the voice that followed, a whisper that seemed to come from inside her own head. "You can't escape, Evelyn. You can't escape what you've done." And as the walls began to bleed and the floor beneath her feet turned to churning water, Evelyn realized that her descent into madness had only just begun. Evelyn woke with a start, her heart racing. The bedroom was bathed in the pale light of dawn, shadows retreating to the corners. For a moment, she allowed herself to hope it had all been a nightmare. But the lingering sense of dread told her otherwise. She rose slowly, her body aching as if she'd run a marathon. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. As she made her way to the kitchen, Evelyn tried to rationalize the events of the past day. "Stress," she muttered to herself. "It's just stress and guilt playing tricks on my mind." The kitchen seemed normal at first glance. Evelyn reached for the coffee pot, desperate for some semblance of routine. As she waited for the coffee to brew, her eyes were drawn to a small object on the counter. A pebble, smooth and dark, like those found at the bottom of the lake. She hadn't noticed it before. Frowning, Evelyn picked it up. It was cold to the touch, colder than it should be. As she held it, a memory flashed through her mind: her sister, laughing, skipping stones across the lake's surface. The pebble slipped from Evelyn's suddenly numb fingers, clattering on the floor. The sound seemed to echo unnaturally, and with it came a whisper, so faint she almost missed it. "Remember, Evelyn?" Evelyn spun around, her heart pounding. The kitchen was empty, but the air felt heavy, charged with an unseen presence. The coffee maker beeped, making her jump. As she poured a cup with shaking hands, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She made her way to the living room, coffee clutched like a lifeline. The lake was visible through the window, its surface deceptively calm. Evelyn's gaze was drawn to the old photo album on the coffee table. She didn't remember unpacking it. With a sense of trepidation, she opened the album. The photos were familiar family vacations, holidays, lazy summer days at the lake. But as Evelyn turned the pages, she noticed something odd. In each photo, her sister's face was slightly blurred, as if she was turning away from the camera at the last moment. The last photo in the album made Evelyn's blood run cold. It was of her and her sister, taken the day before the accident. But unlike her memories of that day, their expressions were somber, almost fearful. And there, in the background, barely visible in the lake's waters, was a dark shape that looked disturbingly like a hand reaching out. Evelyn slammed the album shut, her breathing ragged. "It's not real," she said aloud, trying to convince herself. "Photos can play tricks on the eye. It doesn't mean anything." But even as she said it, doubt crept in. The pebble in the kitchen, the whisper, now this photo, it was as if the house, the lake itself, was trying to tell her something. Something she had buried deep in her subconscious. As the day wore on, Evelyn found herself jumping at small sounds: the creak of a floorboard, the rustle of curtains in the breeze. Shadows seemed to linger too long in corners, and more than once, she caught a glimpse of movement in her peripheral vision, only to find nothing when she turned to look. By evening, Evelyn's nerves were frayed. She paced the living room, alternating between trying to rationalize her experiences and fighting the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. A soft splash from outside drew her attention. Evelyn approached the window, peering out at the darkening lake. For a moment, all was still. Then she saw it, a ripple in the water, moving against the wind, coming towards the shore. And just beneath the surface, a pale shape that could have been a face. Evelyn stumbled back from the window, her heart in her throat. The logical part of her mind screamed that it was impossible, that she was seeing things. But a deeper, more primal part knew the truth. The lake was calling, and it wouldn't be denied. As night fell, Evelyn huddled on the couch, lights blazing, fighting against exhaustion. She knew that sleep would bring nightmares, or worse, leave her vulnerable to whatever was haunting the house. In the silence, a voice drifted from the direction of the lake, soft and achingly familiar. "Evelyn," it called, her sister's voice filled with sadness and longing. "Why did you let me go, Evelyn?" Tears streamed down Evelyn's face as the memories she'd suppressed for so long began to surface. The argument by the lake, harsh words exchanged, her sister turning away, stumbling. "I didn't mean to," Evelyn whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know. I'm sorry." "I'm so sorry." But the voice didn't respond. Instead, the room grew colder, shadows deepening in the corners. And in those shadows, Evelyn saw movement shapes forming and dissolving, reaching out with ethereal hands before retreating. As Evelyn watched, paralyzed with fear, she realized a terrible truth. The lake hadn't just taken her sister. It had taken a part of her too, a part she could never get back. And now it wanted the rest. The shadows crept closer, and Evelyn knew that her reckoning had only just begun. The abyss had looked back, and it had found her wanting. The night stretched on, an eternity of shadows and whispers. Evelyn huddled on the couch, eyes burning from exhaustion, yet too terrified to close them. The soft lapping of the lake against the shore had become a sinister rhythm, like hungry fingers scratching at the earth. As dawn's first pale light crept through the windows, Evelyn stirred. She had dozed off at some point, her dreams a blur of dark water and reaching hands. The house was quiet now, almost normal, but Evelyn knew better. The horror hadn't left. It had merely retreated, biding its time. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone. 5 missed calls from the hospital. A text from her colleague, Dr. Simmons. "Evelyn, where are you?" Patients waiting. Call ASAP. Reality crashed back in. She had a life, responsibilities. People who depended on her. For a moment, Evelyn considered fleeing, leaving this cursed house and its secrets behind. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't matter. The lake's call would follow her. Summoning what little courage she had left, Evelyn dialed Dr. Simmons. "Evelyn." "Thank God. Are you all right?" Simmons' voice was thick with concern. I'm not feeling well," Evelyn managed, her voice hoarse. "I need to take a few days off." There was a pause. "Evelyn, this isn't like you. Is everything okay?" "No," Evelyn wanted to scream. "Nothing is okay. My dead sister is calling me from the lake. The house is alive with shadows. I'm losing my mind." Instead, she forced a weak laugh. "Just a bad case of flu, I think. I'll be back next week." After hanging up, Evelyn sat in silence, the weight of her lies pressing down on her. How could she explain what was happening? Who would believe her? As the day wore on, Evelyn tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. She showered, made coffee, even attempted to read a medical journal. But her eyes kept drifting to the window, to the innocuous-looking lake beyond. Around noon, a knock at the door made her jump. For a wild moment, Evelyn imagined opening it to find her sister's waterlogged corpse. But when she peered through the peephole, she saw Mrs. Garrett, her elderly neighbor, holding a casserole dish. Evelyn opened the door, pasting on a smile. "Mrs. Garrett, how kind of you to stop by." The old woman's eyes narrowed as she took in Evelyn's appearance. "Good heavens, dear. You look like you've seen a ghost." If only you knew, Evelyn thought. "I brought you some dinner," Mrs. Garrett continued, pushing the dish into Evelyn's hands. "We neighbors have to look out for each other, especially with all the strange goings-on lately." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. "Strange goings-on?" Mrs. Garrett nodded solemnly. "Oh, yes. Lights on the lake at night. Voices carried on the wind. And just last week, the Johnson's boy swore he saw a woman walking on the water at dawn." She leaned in, lowering her voice. "They say this lake has always had its secrets. Best not to dig too deep, if you know what I mean." As Mrs. Garrett shuffled away, Evelyn stood frozen in the doorway. She wasn't alone in her experiences. But rather than comforting her, this knowledge only deepened her dread. The lake's influence was spreading. That night, Evelyn dreamed. She was underwater, sinking slowly into the dark depths. Around her, pale faces watched her descent, their eyes accusing. Her sister swam before her, beautiful and terrible. "You can't escape this, Evelyn," her sister said, bubbles streaming from her mouth. "The lake has marked you. It's in your blood now." Evelyn woke with a gasp, her nightgown soaked with sweat. Or was it lake water? In the dim light, she couldn't be sure. Days blurred together. Evelyn stopped answering her phone, stopped looking at emails. The outside world receded, becoming as insubstantial as a dream. Only the house and the lake felt real now. She found herself spending hours staring at the water, watching for ripples, for faces beneath the surface. Sometimes she thought she saw her sister standing on the far shore, waving. Other times, dark shapes moved in the depths, always just out of clear sight. On the seventh night, Evelyn woke to find herself standing at the lake's edge, the cold water lapping at her feet. She had no memory of leaving the house, of walking down to the shore. Panic rose in her throat as she stumbled backward. "No," she whispered, her voice raw. "I won't let you take me." But even as she said it, Evelyn knew it wasn't true. The lake had already taken her, in all the ways that mattered. Her life, her career, her sanity, all were slipping away, drawn inexorably into the dark waters. As she turned to flee back to the house, Evelyn caught her reflection in a window. For a moment, just a moment, she saw not herself but her sister staring back, a sad smile on her lips. Evelyn realized then that she would never leave this place. The lake had claimed her, body and soul. She was as much a part of its dark history now as her sister, as all those who had been lost to its depths over the years. She was home, and home was a nightmare from which there was no waking. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Evelyn blinked awake, her mind foggy and disoriented. White walls, the antiseptic smell, the steady beep of monitors a hospital room materialized around her. "Dr. Marsh? Can you hear me?" A familiar voice cut through the haze. Dr. Simmons, her colleague, leaned over her, concern etched on his face. Evelyn tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her voice a rasp. "What happened?" Dr. Simmons' expression softened with relief. "You've been in a coma for 3 weeks, Evelyn. There was an accident at the lake house. You fell and hit your head. We weren't sure you'd wake up." Memories flooded back the lake, the whispers, her sister's face in the water. But they felt distant now, like a half-remembered dream. "It wasn't real," Evelyn whispered, unsure if she felt relief or loss. "The accident was real," Dr. Simmons said gently. "But whatever you experienced while unconscious, that was your mind trying to process trauma. You're safe now." Over the next few days, as Evelyn regained her strength, the nightmare of the lake house began to fade. Colleagues visited, bringing flowers and well wishes. Her patients sent cards, expressing hope for a quick return. The world of medicine, of science and reason, reasserted itself. And yet, as Evelyn prepared for discharge, she couldn't shake a lingering unease. The lake house had been sold. She'd signed the papers from her hospital bed, eager to be rid of the painful memories. But sometimes in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, she thought she heard the lapping of water against a distant shore. 1 month after her release, Evelyn returned to work. Her office was as she'd left it, journals stacked neatly, diplomas on the wall, a photo of her and her sister on the desk. She picked up the frame, studying her sister's smiling face. For a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw water droplets on the glass. Evelyn shook her head, banishing the thought. She was a woman of science, after all. There were patients to see, lives to improve, research to conduct. The nightmare was over. But that night, as she drifted off to sleep in her city apartment, miles from any lake, Evelyn could have sworn she felt a cool, damp hand caress her cheek. And in her dreams, a familiar voice whispered, "Welcome back, Evelyn. We've been waiting for you." She woke with a start, heart pounding. The digital clock read 3:33 a.m. Her bedroom was quiet, normal. And yet, on her nightstand, unnoticed until now, sat a small, smooth pebble, dark and cold, like those found at the bottom of a lake. Evelyn reached for it with trembling fingers, then hesitated. Outside her window, a car splashed through a puddle, the sound unnervingly like gentle waves lapping at a shore. She drew her hand back, leaving the pebble untouched. Tomorrow, she would return to her patients, to the world of reason and science. But a part of her would always remain at the lake house, caught between reality and nightmare, never quite sure which was which. As Evelyn lay back down, she whispered a quiet prayer, though whether it was to be spared from the lake's call, or to be drawn back into its depths, even she couldn't say. Thank you for listening. Now try to sleep.